8. Do you remember Trademark, Gabe? Yes, sort of. Though they didn't let children go. You had to be older than 12. Thanks goodness for that, Jonas said. Gabe reached toward the plate and took another cookie. Kira was a wonderful cook. The cookies she had served for dessert were crisp and studded with dried fruits and nuts. He hadn't been counting really, but he thought this was his 6th. Gabe and Jonas were seated together on the pillow-strewn couch. Gabe had had a bath and Jonas had provided him with clean clothes. He was glad he hadn't had to go back to Boys' Lodge after the boat's disaster. The other boys would have made jokes about it. They probably would for weeks to come. But at least for now, this first evening, he wouldn't have to listen and try to smile. Kira was tucking the children into bed. Gabe had watched her with them earlier as she fed them their supper and wiped their smeared, sleepy faces, talking softly to them about the nice day they had had, about a picnic and the flowers they had picked. In a small earthen pot on the table, the bouquet of yellow loose-striped purple cornflowers and lacy ferns cast a shadow against the wall in the dimming light. Gabe had little interest in babies. He would rather talk to Frolic, the old, overweight dog asleep on the floor, than to Matthew and Annabelle, with their grabby hands and screechy giggles. He was relieved when Kira finally took them off to bed. It amused him that Jonas kissed their sweaty little necks and called the night-night affectionately as they toddled off with their mother. But still, he felt an enormous sadness that he hadn't entirely understand when he watched Kira with her children. He felt a loss, a hole in his own life. Had any woman ever murmured to him that way, or brushed crumbs gently from his cheek? Had anyone ever mothered him? Jonas had told him no. A manufactured product, Jonas had said, describing his origin sadly. But he thought he remembered something else, a dim blur, that's all. But it was there. Someone had held him, had whispered to him. Someone had loved him once. He was sure of it. He was sure he could find it. Could find her, if only the stupid boat. Try to stay awake, Gabe. I know it's been a long day, but I want to talk to you. He had been drifting off. Gabe shook himself fully awake and took another sip from his cup of tea. About Trademark? He asked. I barely remember it, just listening to people talk about it. It was creepy in some way, but kind of exciting. We always wanted to sneak in, me and the other boys. It had been going on for years, Jonas described. I never paid much attention to it until I became later. Then I began to see that. He paused when Kira came into the room, carrying a cup of tea. She sat down in a nearby chair. I'm telling Gabe about Trademark. Kira nodded. I wasn't here then, she told Gabe, but Jonas has described it to me. She made a face and shivered slightly. Scary. Gabe didn't say anything. He wondered why they were talking about an event that had ended years before. It had always seemed to me like a simple entertainment, Jonas said. Everyone got dressed up. There was a lot of merriment to their preparations. But as I got older, I began to sense that there was always a nervousness to it, an uneasiness. So when I became leader, I began going to watch. Gabe yawned. So what happened exactly? He asked politely. It was a kind of ritualized thing. Every now and then, this man appeared in the village. He always wore strange clothes and talked in an odd, convoluted way. He was called the trade master. He got up on the stage and called people forward one by one. Then he invited them to make trades. Trades? Gabe asked. Meaning what? Well, people would tell him what they most wanted. They'd say it loudly. Everyone could hear. And then they told him what they were willing to trade for it, but they whispered that part. Gabe looked puzzled. Give me an example, he said. Suppose it was your turn. You would go to the stage and tell Trade Master what you wanted most. What might you ask for? Gabe hesitated. He couldn't put into words, really, the thing he truly wanted. Finally, he shrugged. A good boat, I guess. And then you would whisper to him what you were willing to trade away in order to get it. Gabe made a face. I don't have anything. Most people think that, and they thought that then, but they found otherwise. He suggested to them that they trade parts of themselves. Gabe sat up straighter, more awake, intrigued now. Like a finger or something? Or an ear? There's a woman here in the village who only has one ear. The other got chopped off before she came here, as punishment for something, I think. There are places that do those kinds of horrible punishments. I know, and I know the woman you mean. You're right. She escaped from a place with a cruel government. But Trademaster was asking for something different. You had to trade. Let me think how to describe it. Part of your basic character. Like what? Well, if you wanted a boat, he'd be able to provide that. But let's think about your character, Gabe. You're what? Energetic, I'd say. And smart. I do pretty well in school. Honest. Likeable. Well, I'm honest, that's true. I'm not always likeable. I'm pretty mean to Simon sometimes. Jonas chuckled. Well, you're energetic. Agreed? Yes, I'm energetic. Let's use that just for the example. Suppose Trademaster could give you a really fine boat, Gabe. You'd have to trade for it, though. You'd have to trade your energy. You'd be on the stage. He'd whisper to you what the trade would consist of. No one would be able to hear that, just you. But then he'd say loudly, trade, and you'd have to reply, easy, a fine boat, I'd say trade. He'd write it down, and I'd get my boat. You would. I never knew of anyone asking for a boat, so I don't know how it would appear. But he had amazing powers. Probably a fine boat would be waiting for you the next day at the river. Yes, Gabe was wide awake now, fascinated by the thought of how easily he might have obtained a boat. But don't forget, you would have made a trade for it, and your energy would have been taken from you. You might wake up the next morning and be unable to get out of bed. So I'd rest for a day till I felt energetic. Gabe, Trademaster has enormous power. He could take your energy permanently. So I'd be in a wheelchair or something for the rest of my life? Could be. All right, that wouldn't work. I wouldn't trade my energy. But what would your other choices be? Gabe thought. Honesty, smartness. I could have maybe traded one of those. Think about it. Well, I could trade my honesty. Then I'd be a dishonest person, but I'd have a really good boat. He shrugged. That might work. Jonas laughed. Anyway, he said, that's what Trademart was all about. It began to corrupt the people of the village. They traded away the best parts of themselves, the way you would have, in order to get the foolish things they thought they wanted or needed. A boat isn't foolish, Gabe argued. He yawned. Jonas got up and went to where the tea kettle was simmering. He made himself another cup of tea. Kira, tea? He asked, but she shook her head. Take my word for it, Gabe, he said when he sat back down. Trademaster was taking control of this village, and he was pure evil. It became clear when Maddie died. That was the end of Trademart. Gabe saw that Kira had put her hands to her face. She had been very close to Maddie. They all were silent for a moment. Outside, it had begun to rain. They could hear it against the roof. Then Jonas said, I want to talk to you, Gabe, about powers. Powers? Gabe suddenly felt uneasy. They were entering a realm that they had approached before. Maybe a better word is gifts. I have a certain power, or gift. It became apparent when I was young, 12 or so. I was able to focus on something and will myself to see. He sighed and looked at Kira. I don't know how to describe this to him, he said. Kira tried. Jonas can see beyond Gabe. He can see to another place, but he has to work very hard at it. It depletes him. And the power is ebbing, Jonas added. I can feel that it's leaving me. Kira is experiencing the same thing. You mean she has a gift too? Mine's different. Mine has always been through my hands, Kira explained. I realized it the way Jonas did. When I was young, my hands began to be able to do things, to make things, that an ordinary pair of hands can't. But now, she smiled. It's leaving me as well, and that's all right. I think Jonas and I don't need these gifts anymore. We've used them to create our life here. We've helped others, and our time of such powers is passing now. But we've talked about you, Gabe. We feel certain that you have some kind of gift. I felt it when you were very young, Gabe, Jonas said. When I took you and escaped the place where we were, I've been waiting for it to make itself known to you. He looked at Gabe as if something might become apparent at that moment. Gabe shifted uncomfortably on the couch. Well, he said finally, it's not a gift for boat building, is it? Jonas chuckled. No, he said, but you're very determined. That serves you well. And I think you're going to need that determination and your energy. In fact, all your attributes, plus whatever special gift you haven't discovered yet. I have discovered it, Gabe thought. I can veer. But he stayed silent. He simply didn't feel ready to tell them. Because you have a hard job ahead of you, Jonas continued. What do you mean? I'm going to use the last of my own power, Jonas said. I'm going to see beyond one final time. Why? Asked Kira, startled. Gabe echoed her. Why? I have to find out where Trademaster is, Jonas told them both. He's still out there somewhere. He's quite near, and he's terribly dangerous. The rain had become louder, drenching, and a wind had risen. Tree branches whipped against the side of the house. Kira rose suddenly from her chair and pulled the window closed. Jonas paid no attention. And Gabe, he said, when I find them. Gabe waited. He was wide awake now. It's going to be up to you then. You must destroy him. Me? Why me? He's nothing to do with me. Jonas took a deep breath. It's everything to do with you, Gabe. But it's a very long story. I was going to tell it to you tonight, but I can see how tired you are. And it's late. Let's get some sleep now. And in the morning, I'll explain it to you. 9. The leaves dripped onto the wet grass, but the rain had stopped and a pale sun had risen. It was late morning now, and Gabe was just waking. He had slept fitfully on the couch until finally nudged awake by the household noises. He yawned and opened his eyes. He watched Kira tending the children. In her soft voice, she spoke firmly to Matthew, who was trying to grab a toy from his sister. Annabel held it tightly in her fist and looked defiantly at her brother. No, she said. Kira laughed. When she saw that Gabe was awake, she turned away from the little ones. How are you feeling? She asked. You slept a long time. Gabe nodded. He looked around the room. I'm all right. I had strange dreams. I'm sorry I slept so late. You should have woken me. Is Jonas here? No, he had to leave. But he promised to explain. I know, and he will. But he got an urgent message early this morning. Someone in the village is quite sick. Why did they call for him? He's not a healer. They usually call herbalist. Kira shrugged. I'm not sure. Apparently she asked for him. Are you hungry? The children just had some bread and jam. Would you like some? Gabe went to the table. She poured milk into a thick cup for him. He drank some and spread raspberry jam on the crusty, freshly baked bread. He watched when she turned her attention again to the toddlers. Do you think they'll remember this moment when they're older? He asked suddenly. Fighting over a toy? Eating bread and jam? Probably not. They're too little for specific memories like that. But I think they'll remember the general feeling of being taken care of being scolded now and then, maybe of being held and hugged. She poured more milk into his empty cup. Why? I don't know. I just wondered. I think I remember being very small and sleeping beside my mother. When I think of it, I feel her warmth, and I think maybe she sang to me. I suppose I was just about the age of Annabelle, Kira smiled. I didn't walk when I was her age. It took me a long time to walk because of my leg. One of her legs were twisted. It was why she leaned on a stick when she walked. He glanced at her, at the stick, when she spoke of it, but his mind was not on that. I don't have a single memory like that. What do you remember, Gabe? Kira asked him. I rode in the seat on the back of a bike. You know, that bicycle in the museum? Of course. I remember that a little, but it was Jonas who brought me here on that bike. He wasn't my parent. I don't remember a mother the way you do, the way Annabelle and Matthew will. Except, he paused. Except what? Gabe squirmed on his chair. There was a woman. I know there was, and she loved me. Kira smiled. Of course she did. Kira, I really know. Last night, when you and Jonas were talking about your gifts, she looked at him. Yes, I didn't want to tell you. I don't know why. Maybe I just needed to test it one more time. Test what? Kira glanced toward the children, who were now playing quietly. She came to the table and sat down in the chair next to Gabe. My gift. I do have one. I call it veering. Go on. At first, it just happened. It always surprised me. But then I found I could choose the time. I could direct it. I could cause it to happen. Was it that way for you? Kira nodded. Yes, it was. And this morning, just a few minutes ago, you were over there with the children. Gabe nodded toward the corner of the room where the two little ones were industriously piling blocks into towers. I was lying on the couch, half awake, watching, and I decided to veer into Matthew. Into Matthew? Kira looked puzzled. Yes, because he's the boy. I suppose it's not that different with a girl, but I needed to know how it felt to be a small boy looking at his mother. They both glanced over at Matthew. His tongue was wedged between his lips, and he was frowning with concentration as he balanced the blue wooden triangle on top of a pile of square red blocks. So I concentrated really hard. The first thing that happens is a silence. You were talking to the children, showing them how the blocks fit together, and just as you said, see the shapes? You were holding up a yellow one, and... Yes, Annabelle took it from me, Kira said. Maybe. I don't remember that because the silence happened. I never notice what's happening when the silence comes. But then I veered into Matthew. I entered Matthew. You never moved from that couch. No, my body doesn't move, but my awareness shifts, Kira nodded. And then Gabe went on. I became part of Matthew's feelings at that moment. I felt them. I understood them. So your gift is understanding how someone feels? More than understanding it, feeling it. And this morning when I did that, I felt my own little self, my baby self, experiencing what Matthew was experiencing at that moment. He was receiving so much love from his mother. Kira, beginning to understand, nodded. For Matthew, that was coming from me. But for you, Gabe, you were remembering. Yes, I don't know her name or where she is now, but I know for certain who she was. The two of them sat silently, watching the children play. Later, after he had helped her clean up the lunch dishes, Kira said, I'm going to take the children for a walk. Want to come? She lifted two small jackets from a hook on the wall. When's Jonas coming back? I don't know. I'm surprised that he's been gone so long. Is it all right if I wait here for him? Of course, you and he have a lot to talk about. Gabe looked through the window, down at the winding path that crisscrossed the village. People hurried along, busy with midday tasks. Beyond the orchard, he could see the library. It appeared closed. Nearby in the playing field, the children were running around with the ball that they passed back and forth. He could hear their shouts. It was an ordinary day in the quiet, well-ordered place. Yet someone in the village, someone was very ill, and Jonas was there. "I think I'll go to look for him," Gabe said suddenly. "Do you know where he went? Who is it who is so sick?" Kira reached into a small sleeve and guided Annabelle's chubby arm through. "Other side now," she said to the little girl, and held open the other sleeve. "Can you do yours by yourself?" she asked Matthew, whose jacket was on the floor in front of him. He grinned and shook his head no. "A woman named Claire," she said to Gabe, in answer to his question. "I'm sure you've seen her in the village. She's very, very old." "Oh, her! Yes, I've seen her often." "Well, I fear you won't be seeing her much longer. It sounds as if her time is running out." With both children now buttoned into their jackets, Kira headed to the door with Annabelle in her arms and Matthew by one hand. "Can you open the door for me?" "Is it all right if I leave my paddle here?" He looked toward the corner where it was propped against the wall. The sunlight made it gleam golden. "Of course. I won't let the children play with it." Gabe held her through the door and down the front steps. "Do you know where she lives? Or is she in the infirmary?" "Jonas went to her house. It's over there someplace," Kira indicated, nodding her head. "A place beyond the library, beyond the schoolhouse." He could see the small cottages, deep in shade, that dotted the wooded area. Gabe thanked her quickly for the place to eat and sleep after such a bad day. Then, as Kira headed with the children to the play area nearby, he began to jog toward the place where Claire lived and where Jonas was with her now. He wanted to talk more about what Jonas had proposed that night. It had been on his mind since he had awakened. He was to kill someone named the Trade Master. It made no sense. Jonas was a peaceful, compassionate man. All right, maybe this Trade Master guy was bad. Maybe even pure evil, but he wasn't bothering anyone they knew. They would watch out for him, would fend him off if he showed signs of trying to return to the village and do harm. Gabe thought with a wry smile. Maybe they should just put him into my stupid boat and give it a firm shove into the river. The little cottage was deep in a thicket of trees, but he had no trouble finding the place where Claire lived. Several aged women stood somberly outside, murmuring to one another. So sudden, he overheard what woman said to another. "Came upon her just like that. She was fine last night." "Happens that way," a tall, white-haired woman said knowingly, and several others nodded. Gabe excused himself politely as he passed them. "Is Jonas inside?" he asked. A woman nodded. "She asked for him, first thing." "Strange," she murmured. "Is it all right if I go in?" Gabe asked. No one seemed to be in charge. They all looked at him blankly, and he took it as permission. The door stood partially open, and he entered after a quiet knock on the wood, which drew no reply. The interior was very dim. It was bright outside on this clear day after the night's rain, but the windows of the cottage were small and woven curtains were drawn across. He smelled stale food, old age, dried herbs, and dust. Herbalist, who ordinarily tended the sick, sat quietly in a rocking chair. Gabe looked around. "Jonas?" "Over here." He followed the voice and found Jonas sitting in the shadows beside the bed. Again he wondered. Why? Why had the old woman asked for Jonas? And how soon could Jonas excuse himself and come away? Gabe needed to talk to him. Their conversation last night had seemed urgent. More than urgent, it had been alarming. Jonas, the most peaceful of souls, seemed to be commanding Gabe to commit a murder. He had not explained, not really. He had said they would discuss it more fully in the morning. Now morning had passed, and Gabe wanted to know more. The old woman was dying, as old people always do. It was the natural way of things. Her friends were nearby, and Herbalist was sitting in the corner. She didn't need Jonas. Not as much as Gabe did. Can't you leave? Gabe whispered, moving closer. We need to talk. You promised to explain. Shh. Jonas held up a hand. Now, through the dim light, he could see Jonas more clearly, and the woman in the bed as well. Her eyes were open, and it was clear that she had seen Gabe approaching. Her thin fingers moved, plucking at the blanket. Jonas was watching her very closely. Now he leaned forward, as if to listen. Her thin, dry lips were moving. Gabe could not hear, at first, what she said, but Jonas did. Jonas was nodding. Gabe stood there uncertainly. The woman's mouth began to move again, and he found himself leaning forward to listen. This time, nearer, he could hear the words. Tell him, she was saying to Jonas. 10. I'm sorry. I just don't believe you. Gabe's voice was both skeptical and firm. Jonas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. He cupped his own face with his hands. They were sitting together on the bench behind the library, the same bench where he had so recently sat with Claire. He looked up and sighed. I felt the same way yesterday when she told it to me. I sat here thinking, this woman is crazy. Is that what you're thinking now of me, Gabe? Gabe shook his head and looked away. He wanted to be someplace else, off with his logic mates, building another boat, sinking another boat. He didn't care. Anywhere but here, listening to this unbelievable story being told to him by a man he loved. And last night, this same man had talked of the need to destroy someone. It was scary. It was sad. He turned to Jonas and tried to speak in a soothing voice. You know what? You've been working awfully hard. Probably reading too much. You should take a long walk along the river. Have a nice, relaxing, restful. Gabe, listen to me. We don't have much time. This is not a wild, made-up thing. This is real. She remembers you. She remembers me. Jonas paused and took a deep breath. I know you were very young when we left the community, so you won't recall these things. But I do, Gabe. I remember seeing her there. She used to work at the fish hatchery, but in her spare time she came to the nurturing center and helped out. She did that because you were there, Gabe. She had given birth to you. It's the way things were done there. Young girls produced babies. They weren't called babies. They were called new children. The birth mothers turned them out like factory products. Then the babies were moved to the nurturing center and eventually assigned to couples who applied for children. That's how your parents got you? Gabe asked. Jonas nodded. So some girl had given birth to you? Yes, but you don't know who? Jonas shook his head. And some other girl, or maybe it was the same one, gave birth to me years later. Claire gave birth to you. You were the only child she ever had. But you're saying she ended up working in the fish place? Jonas nodded. Yes, they determined that she couldn't handle any more birth. She had difficulty when you were born, so they gave her another job. But she spent all her time watching over you. She loved you, Gabe, but love wasn't permitted. Gabe leaned down, slipped off one of the sandals he was wearing, and dislodged the pebble that had been rubbing against his toe. He watched a bird flutter in a nearby tree and noticed that it had a twig in its beak. He examined the scratch on his arm. He yawned and stretched. He unbuttoned and rebuttoned the neck of his shirt. He investigated his fingernails. Jonas watched him. You know what? Gabe said at last. I guess I can believe all of that. You've told me before about what the community was like. So, there was a girl. She gave birth to me. I believe that. And, Jonas, I know it was true that she loved me, but... Jonas nodded. I know. It's the rest of it. Yes, the rest of it is just crazy. That old woman, I'm supposed to believe that some man in strange-looking clothes... He noticed that Jonas was no longer looking at him. He was looking across the grassy area, to the path beyond. Gabe followed Jonas's gaze and saw Mentor, the elderly schoolmaster, walking slowly along the path. Nothing unusual. It was school vacation now. Mentor was a part of the village. One often saw him walking around. To his surprise, Jonas rose from the bench and called to Mentor. "Come with me, Gabe," he said. He followed Jonas's quick strides toward the path where Mentor had stopped and was waiting. The bearded schoolmaster was stooped, and his face was lined, but his eyes were keen and intelligent. Gabe had always liked Mentor, even when he had not liked school. "Good morning," he said. "What can I do for you, gentlemen, this morning?" "Mentor," Jonas began, "I'm trying to explain to Gabe here about Trademaster, about his powers." Mentor visibly winced. "That's of the past," he said abruptly. "It's forgotten." "I'm afraid it isn't," Jonas told them. "We have a rather urgent situation. I'll describe it to you later, but right now I need you to help me convince Gabe that the powers exist. He finds it hard to believe." "It is hard to believe," Mentor agreed, nodding. "In a peaceful village like this, it is hard to conceive of true evil. We don't have a lot of time, Mentor. Could you describe to Gabe the trade you made?" Mentor sighed. "This is necessary?" he asked Jonas. "Necessary and very important." Mentor nodded. "I see. Very well, then. It was years ago, Gabe. You were a little boy. I remember how mischievous you were in school, sometimes inattentive." "I know," Gabe acknowledged in embarrassment. "You were too young to go to Trade Mart, but surely you knew of it?" Gabe shrugged. "I guess it seemed kind of mysterious. Some of us adults went every time. There was a kind of entertainment to it, watching other villagers make fools of themselves. But you didn't usually attend, did you, Jonas?" Jonas shook his head. "It didn't ever interest me until it got out of hand, and by then I was leader and had to take action. Well, I was a fool. Many of us were. I was an old man, widowed, lonely. I lived with my daughter, but I knew she would marry someday and I'd be alone. I felt sorry for myself. I had this birthmark. The school children used to call me Rosie because of it. Remember Gabe?" Gabe looked at the deep red stain on Mentor's cheek. He nodded. "We didn't mean any harm." "Of course you didn't," Mentor smiled. "But I was self-pitying and foolish, and there was a woman, a widow, I was attracted to. You understand about that, don't you? Boys your age would understand." Gabe's instinct was to pretend ignorance. The question embarrassed him, but with both Mentor and Jonas watching him intently, it seemed a time for honesty. "Yes," he said, "I understand." "So," Mentor said with a deep sigh, "I went to Trade Mart and for the first time, I asked to make a trade." "What did you ask for?" Mentor laughed, but it was a sardonic laugh. "I told the trade master that I want to be younger and handsome. I wanted the stocktender's widow to fall in love with me." Gabe looked at the ground. He was embarrassed for Mentor, that he must make such a confession of his own idiocy. He couldn't do that kind of transformation, could he? You should have asked for, I don't know, maybe a set of new desks for the schoolhouse. "Evil can do anything, Gabe," Mentor said, "for a price." Gabe stared at him. "What was the price?" he asked after a moment. His terms were vague enough that they sounded unimportant. He's very clever, Trademaster is. He sets his terms, but we don't really understand them when we agree to the trade. He told me I would have to trade away my honor." "So you said no?" Mentor shook his head. I grabbed at it, eagerly. "I told you I was a fool." "But Mentor, you are an honorable man. Everyone knows that. And I don't mean to be rude, but you're not young and handsome, so the trade didn't work. No one has that kind of power, not even someone evil." "Oh, it worked. It worked for many of us here in the village." Me, I grew taller and my bald spot disappeared. Thick hair where once there had been just this shiny dome. Birthmark? Faded. Faded? Then poof! Gone! You may not have noticed, Gabe. You were a child then, and it was summer, so you weren't in school. But briefly, I was a younger, handsome man. I began courting the pretty widow. But you know what, Gabe? What? Gabe was stunned. So, Trademaster, whoever he was, did have incredible powers. He could have made a trade with the woman. What was her name? Claire. He tried to pay attention to what Mentor was saying, but his thoughts now were on what this all meant. What it meant to him, Gabe, and to the woman, Claire, who may have made a terrible trade in order to find her. I am her son, he whispered aloud. Mentor hadn't heard him. He continued talking. I had traded away the most important part of myself. I turned selfish, cruel. The pretty widow didn't want a man like that, so I had made a meaningless trade, and I had turned into a person I hated, but a handsome one, and young. Gabe forced himself to pay attention to the schoolmaster. What changed you back? You're a man of honor now, Mentor. Jonas stepped in. Trade mart had corrupted the whole village. Many people had traded away their bad selves. We turned on each other. There was greed and jealousy and, well, it had to end. There was a set of horrible events. We lost one of our best young people. Maddie? Yes, Maddie died, battling the evil. But because of him, the rest of us survived and were restored. I got my bald head and my birthmark back, he laughed. And I lost my silly romance, still a bachelor today. And we banished Trademaster, Jonas reminded them. We did, forever. Mentor said it with a kind of relief and satisfaction. He turned to leave. Then he said slowly, with a questioning look, Something is wrong? Jonas nodded. He's returned, he said. Mentor looked stunned. So this battle must be waged again? Jonas nodded. This time we must be sure it's final. Whom do we send this time? To die? Mentor's voice was bitter and sad. Like everyone, he had loved Maddie. I'm going, Gabe told them. Mentor was silent. Then, without speaking, he turned away from them. Gabe and Jonas stood watching the aged schoolmaster walk away. His shoulders were slumped. He got himself back, Gabe said, after a moment. Jonas nodded. He did. That means a trade can be reversed, Gabe said. Jonas nodded. I'm scared. I am too, Jonas replied. For you, for all of us. She is my mother. She is my mother. Gabe took a deep breath. How much time do we have? He asked.